1 whole year after King Philip II was violently assassinated, Alexander the Great was finally heading east. He was going to conquer the Persian Empire. In a not-so-subtle statement of his ambition, the Macedonian march followed the same route as Xerxes' invasion of Greece, way back in the Persian Wars of the 5th century BC. A fitting start to a campaign of vengeance. Alexander was risking everything. Argead rule in Macedonia was tenuous at best, and royal rivals were partial to a good assassination. If he failed on this campaign, Alexander's reign would meet a premature and blood-stained end. There was just one tiny problem that Alexander's boundless courage could not fix: money. The king was broke. The resources needed to challenge a power as vast as the Persian Empire were immense, and Alexander's piggy bank had more cobwebs than coins. There was no time to waste. If Alexander didn't get to Asia and start capturing the land, the food, and the wealth of Persian cities, his army would starve after just 1 month. The timer was set. So in 334 BC, Alexander left his kingdom. He didn't know it then, but he was saying goodbye to his homeland forever. An impressive force of 30,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry covered 300 miles across the coast in just 20 days, arriving at Sestos near the Hellespont. Alexander sailed on the lead ship of 160 triremes, ferrying the Macedonian army into Asia. The king was the first to disembark, leaping from his ship in full armour, and, with a dramatic flair, he claimed the Persian land as his by right of conquest. But you can't call dibs on an empire, especially one of the most powerful empires the world has ever seen. Whilst he waited for the rest of the army to make their way across, Alexander went to Troy. He visited the tomb of Achilles, made sacrifices at the temple of Athena, and even sacrificed to Priam, the long-dead king of Troy. Greek ancestors had destroyed Troy and hacked the old king to pieces, but it's always nice to let bygones be bygones. Now finished seeing the sights, Alexander returned to his army at Arisbe. The great invasion had at last begun. While Alexander was mobilizing on the east coast, 1,000 miles away in the heart of the empire at Persepolis, Darius, the Persian king, was kicking back and relaxing. Darius was twice Alexander's age, but just as new to the crown, also coming to power through assassination, or in his case, a whole bunch of them. In 338 BC, a eunuch named Bagoas was pulling the strings in the Persian court. He wanted the real power. He poisoned King Artaxerxes III to control his infant son, Artaxerxes IV. When the young ruler was old enough to start making decisions of his own, Bagoas poisoned him too. Darius III ascended the throne in the wake of these untimely deaths. Bagoas assumed he would be easier to control, but the scheming assassin was mortally misguided. When he tried his luck as kingmaker for the 3rd time, Darius forced him to drink his own poison. 1 year later, and Darius was still figuring out how to be the most powerful man on earth. The greatest strength of Persia was also its greatest weakness. The empire was simply massive. There was no way for Darius to personally respond to border disputes on the fringes of his vast domain. He was too far away. For now, Darius had to rely on local leaders, his loyal satraps, to deal with local problems. Alexander was striking west, city after city falling with little resistance. So far from the heart of the empire, the people were simply swapping one emperor for another. The local Persian satraps gathered their forces at Zelia, a formidable force of 20,000 infantry and 20,000 cavalry. They began weighing up their options, and neither were overly tempting. They could burn everything and run, burn the crops, burn the cities, and slowly starve the enemy using the scorched earth strategy. But explaining to locals that you need to set fire to everything they've ever known never goes down well. Give people a choice between a king who burns their home and another who wants to kill the king who burns their home, and the Persian satraps could push more and more cities into Alexander's welcoming arms. Alexander would become a savior. They had to march out and face Alexander head on. They chose a strong position on the far bank of the Granicus River and waited for the Macedonian army to come to them. Now, most generals wouldn't even think to march their army across the river, up the muddy bank, and attack a larger force. But that's exactly what Alexander was planning. His closest advisor, Parmenion, pleaded with the headstrong young king to reconsider. He begged Alexander to wait until dawn Alexander shrugged off the suggestion. The legendary Macedonian army would not be stopped by a petty stream. Parmenion, fighting the urge to shake some sense into his young king, slumped off to take charge of the left wing, as Alexander took up position on the right. The Persian cavalry lined the steep banks and waited, thinking surely that the king wouldn't attack against such overwhelming odds. Nobody would be that crazy. One infantry battalion and 2 units of companion cavalry spearheaded the attack, charging into the river. The vanguard force faced the fiercest fighting. Javelins rained down around their heads as they struggled to escape the water. Just when hope was fading, the tide of battle began to turn. Alexander waded into the water at the head of the main army. He led the right wing in an almighty assault on the densest part of the defences. Using their longer sarissas, they pushed the Persian horses back, gaining ground on the bank. Alexander, leading the charge, was one of the first out of the river, and soon found himself surrounded by enemies. Darius' son-in-law, Mithridates, took his chance. He charged at the Macedonian king at the head of a wedge of Persian cavalry. Alexander met the charge with his personal guard, stabbing his spear into Mithridates' face. A heavy blow glanced off Alexander's helmet, inches from rewriting history. The king killed his attacker with a borrowed spear, but even then another was sneaking up behind and raising his sword. At the last second, Cletus the Black leapt to his king's defence. He hacked off the man's arm as it swung through the air towards the king's head. Alexander was saved. The rest of the army had finally scrambled up the bank. On equal ground, the inexperienced Persian cavalry was no match and quickly crumbled, deserting the infantry in their desperation to escape. The 20,000 Persian infantry were surrounded and slaughtered. The Battle of the Granicus River didn't just cripple local resistance. It was a shattering blow to the Persian image of invincibility, and Alexander followed it up with a stroke of genius. As the local cities cringed back from the inevitable revenge for their support of the Persian army, Alexander declared that he would show mercy. This was very popular. The locals rushed to show their support for the Macedonian invasion, giving food, horses, and money to their new king. At Ephesus, citizens were even more enthusiastic. They rounded up their oppressive Persian masters and started settling some old scores. Before things could really get out of hand, Alexander had to become peacemaker. Alexander found himself with a full belly, a full treasury, and all the time he needed to carefully plan his next move. Macedonian military might may now be proven against the Persians on land, but they had absolutely no hope of competing out at sea. The Persian fleet had over 400 triremes, whilst the Macedonians had less than half of that number. Alexander's solution was simple. If you can't beat the navy at sea, beat it on the land. Ships would eventually have to come on land to resupply, so if Alexander could control all the ports, he could starve the Persian fleet. He set out first to capture Miletus. The small Macedonian navy rushed to block the narrow strait, stopping the Persian fleet from aiding the city. Isolated, Miletus fell quickly. Some of the defending mercenaries tried to escape by floating on their shields to a nearby island. Alexander was about to have them all killed, but took a moment to appreciate their ingenuity. Resourceful soldiers are more useful than a bunch of skeletons, so they were welcomed into the Macedonian army. They continued the coastal campaign, turning next to Halicarnassus. Before long, the Macedonian army had set up camp outside the city walls. Then things turned weird. As the king lay dozing in his tent, a swallow landed on his head. This was not a good sign. The bird was a very bad omen. Someone was going to betray the king. Meanwhile, on the other side of the camp, 2 Macedonian soldiers got very drunk and somehow came to the conclusion that they could take the city all on their own. They grabbed their weapons and launched a 2-man assault on the city walls. And before long, a full skirmish had erupted. The Macedonians gained the upper hand in the fighting and almost took the city. But the defenders just managed to hold out. The siege dragged on. Slowly, the Macedonian siege engines wore down the outer walls, until the Halicarnassians had no choice but to retreat back to the inner citadel. Alexander didn't want to waste the rest of the year capturing just one city. He left some soldiers to guard the few Persians holding out and handed rule of Halicarnassus over to a friendly Persian governor named Ada. Most armies would retire home for the winter to collect harvest and warm their feet by the fire, safe in the knowledge that their enemies would be doing the same thing. Alexander did not. To solidify his control of the coast, Alexander headed inland, taking cities as he went. It was in the depths of winter when the strange bird omen came true. A plot came to light on the king's life. Darius offered the assassin a big chest of gold and the Macedonian crown if he stuck a dagger in Alexander's back. The traitor was arrested, and after a very long stay in a dark, dingy dungeon, he was relieved of his head. By now, Alexander was at Gordian, where he was told about an intriguing local legend. In the Temple of Zeus was an ancient wagon, said to have belonged to the mythical founders of the royal line of Phrygia. Tied to the wagon was the Gordian Knot, a knot so insanely complicated that no one in history had ever been able to untie it. But here's the part that caught Alexander's attention. An ancient oracle had foretold that someday a man would come, capable of untying the Gordian Knot, and that this man would one day rule all of Asia.